Hello, my name is David Raymond. My final project for CSCIE90 cloud computing is AWS Elastic Beanstalk with Java and Eclipse. This is part one of my full presentation. We're going to discuss the problem we're trying to solve with Elastic Beanstalk. I'm going to discuss what Elastic Beanstalk is, give an overview of what it can give us, talk about some terminology around it, talk about some of the architecture around it. We're going to talk about the environmental tiers and types. We're going to talk about a specific type and tier, and that's load balanced web tier. We're going to talk about load balanced web server tier. We're going to do a demo, and this is going to be a static demo. We're going to do a live demo in part two. We're going to talk about the pricing, my observations, and some resources. The Raymond Tech Company provides instance and S3 bucket management services for their clients all over the world. Raymond Tech consultants need a dashboard to help them manage their S3 buckets and EC2 instances. The Raymond Tech Company's main business isn't creating websites or dashboards, so management has a strong desire to get the project done as soon as possible for the least cost and effort. There's also a desire to not create a new infrastructure. Raymond Tech has decided to create a proof-of-concept dashboard using AWS Elastic Beanstalk in order to determine if the project can be done quickly and cheaply. Elastic Beanstalk is the fastest and simplest way to deploy your applications on AWS. You simply use the AWS Management Console, a Git repository, or an integrated development environment such as Eclipse or Visual Studio to upload your application. And Elastic Beanstalk automatically handles the deployment details of capacity provisioning, load balancing, auto scaling, and application health monitoring. Within minutes, your application will be ready to use without any infrastructure or resource configuration work on your part. Elastic Beanstalk is Amazon's platform as a service offering. It allows developers to deploy web and worker applications in the cloud with minimal knowledge of the environment. It allows developers to deploy applications in the cloud with minimal effort, hides the complexity of load balancing, scaling, creating instances, and DNS. It's configurable, integrates with Eclipse, and supports many languages and platforms. In AWS Beanstalk terminology, an application is the highest level Beanstalk component, which includes application versions, environments, and configurations. An application version is a specific version of a deployable code unit, which is then stored in an S3 bucket created by Beanstalk. And a deployable code unit could be a WAR file or a zip file. AWS Beanstalk environment is a collection of resources such as instances, auto-scaling groups, load balancer, security group, on which one specific version of a web or worker application is running. One environment will have one application version deployed to it. However, you can have many environments running the same or different application versions. Environment configuration is just simply a collection of parameters and settings that control the environment and the resources within that environment. A configuration template is a starting point for creating new environment configurations, and you typically use this with the AWS CLI for Beanstalk. I've created a high-level architecture diagram of Elastic Beanstalk, and this just goes over what I just described. You have a Beanstalk application. Underneath that application, you have multiple environments. Environment 1 could be a development environment and maybe hosting the next version of your application, so it might be hosting application version 2. And it has an environmental configuration. Environment 2 is your production environment, and it has application version 1. And underneath that, again, it has an environment configuration. These configurations could be based and are based on a default configuration template, but could be based on a custom configuration template also. Elastic Beanstalk supports multiple environment tiers and environment types. You have two tiers: web tier, an environment for deploying websites, web applications, or web services, and a worker tier, an environment best suited for deploying asynchronous long-running processes and creates a SQS queue-based environment. Then you have two types of environments. You have a single instance environment type, single EC2 instance, which is a single EC2 instance without a load balancer, suitable for environments that don't require scalability, like a dev or test environment, for instance. And you have a load balanced environment type. This is a highly scalable, highly available environment. When you deploy an application to a web server tier, a load balanced web server tier, you get one elastic load balancer to spread requests across many machines. You get every environment, no matter if it's load balanced or not, gets its own URL, and that URL has a CNAME associated with it, which you enter. And this could be something like rad-QA or rad-prod, and it's basically a URL for your environment. And this is aliased to the load balancer. You get an auto-scaling group, which will start additional Amazon instances to accommodate increasing load. You'll get a security group that allows all IP traffic through port 80. You will get, for your load balancer, you will get at least one EC2 instance based on the platform you chose. For example, for Java, you might select Tomcat, so you will get EC2 Linux instances running Tomcat. Each instance is a piece of software called the host manager, which is responsible for deploying the application, aggregating events and metrics, generating instance-level events, monitoring activities, supporting patching activities, and managing log files. This is a diagram of the load-balanced web tier. It basically shows what we just talked about. I got this diagram from Elastic Beanstalk Developer's Guide, which I highly recommend you read. if you're interested in this technology at all. But it basically covers the same thing. You have a Route 53 DNS server that directs traffic to, or that is associated with your URL, which goes to the, which is mapped to the Elastic Load Balancer. And the Elastic Load Balancer spreads requests across many web app servers that are EC2 instances, and those instances are secured with a security group, and they're within an auto-scaling group. And they're in typically an availability zone, but they can be spread over many availability zones, not just one. Our dashboard is going to look like this. It's going to be a very simple dashboard that will show Amazon S3, a list of Amazon S3 buckets, and a list of Amazon EC2 instances. To deploy our application from Eclipse using AWS Elastic Beanstalk, we will select our project, right-click, select Run As, and then Run on Server. On the next screen, we'll select Manually Define a New Server. We'll select AWS Elastic Beanstalk for Tomcat 7. We will accept the defaults for server host name and server name. On the Configure Application Environment screen, for our region, we're going to select US East. Under Application, we're going to create a new application. This is a Beanstalk application that our application version will be deployed to and our environment will be created within. The name of this particular application is going to be RAD, which stands for Raymond AWS Dashboard. And underneath the environment section, we're going to create an environment, a QA environment. So we're going to give this environment a name of rad-QA. And since it's a QA environment, we do not need it to be load balanced. For type, we're going to select single instance web server environment. On the next screen, we're going to choose our key pair. Our key pair for this project will be draymondkeypair.pem. We're going to click Assign CNAME prefix to new server. We're going to enter a rad-QA for that CNAME. So now the URL for our environment will be that rad-qa.elasticbeanstalk.com. For the rest of the settings, we're going to just choose defaults. And under email address for notifications, you really should put an email address that you'd like to use that will be receiving SNS email notifications from your environment when the health of an instance or when there's an issue in the environment. The environment will be created. The application will start to deploy. And this will take about 5 to 10 minutes for this to happen. On the bottom of your Eclipse development environment, you're going to under the Service tab, you're going to see that a rad-QA AWS Elastic Beanstalk server has been created. This is not a literal server. This is an abstract server, and it's an abstract server of the entire environment that you're creating. Underneath that, in that environment, you have your RAD application has been deployed, and it's starting. You can double-click this server, and you will see configuration information about the server, some of which you can change from within Eclipse, some of which you cannot. After the application has been deployed and the environment has been created, Eclipse will start its internal web browser, and you'll actually see the URL for the new rad-QA environment will be inserted into the URL field. And you'll see that it's rad-qa.elasticbeanstalk.com, just like we specified with the CNAME. You'll see the dashboard is running. Again, on the bottom of the screen, you'll see that there is a rad-QA at AWS Elastic Beanstalk server running. Underneath that, you'll see the RAD application is now started. Pricing. There is no additional cost for using AWS Elastic Beanstalk. You will pay for the underlying infrastructure that's created by Beanstalk. So you will be charged for the load balancers, EC2 instances, S3 buckets, etc. Remember that AWS Elastic Beanstalk will create instances based on your site needs, so the infrastructure could get pretty expensive if you have a lot of traffic to your site. It can get expensive relatively quickly also, but it will most likely pale in comparison to creating your own infrastructure. You can use AWS Elastic Beanstalk with the AWS free usage tier. In summary, the Raymond Tech management was very happy with the time it took to create the proof of concept. They were impressed with the speed of the deployment of the application. They were impressed at how easy it was for the developer to create the QA and production environments for the application. They were impressed at the configurability, scalability, and scalability of the new environments. Most importantly, they were happy with the costs, and they decided to fund the full project. Observation pros. Beanstalk made it much easier to deploy code while creating environments within AWS and had reasonable defaults. Deploying from Eclipse was easy to learn and use, had great configuration management through the AWS Elastic Beanstalk Management Console and through Eclipse, and growing support for things like Glassfish through pre-configured Docker servers, It's Elastic Beanstalk has built-in versioning, which could be a lifesaver when trying to fail back to a previously known good version. It has automatic configuration of notifications, so if you give it your email address or an email address, that group email address box, something to that effect, you subscribe to the SNS messages, then you will get notifications about the health of your environment or if there's any major issues with your environment. This allows you to keep applications up during an application deployment using rolling updates, which are configured in the console and had no extra cost. So Elastic Beanstalk had a lot of pros to it, and it was, great time saver, very cost effective. All right, now some of the cons. Beanstalk is limited to creating 25 applications. It's limited to 500 application versions. It's limited to 10 environments across all applications, and depending on your AWS account, by default, an account can create 20 EC2 instances, 10 load balancers. May not be ideal for all applications. There are very sophisticated applications that have multiple WAR files that need to be deployed, that have back-end processes that aren't necessarily anything that's supported currently through Beanstalk, such as Mule or some integration, Spring integration, and stuff like that, that might still sit on your servers for cost effectiveness and for performance reasons, but may not, but wouldn't be ideal for this type of environment, this type of deployment, and the environment. So there's some environments that won't fit perfectly within Elastic Beanstalk's way of doing things. You're limited to a 512 meg WAR zip file for your application, and you can only deploy in one application file to an environment. So you can only have one version per environment. So this is an important limitation. I think it's very generous, 512 meg, but that would be a very large web application or a very large back-end process. But I still think it's good to know that there's a limit. You could use a lot of libraries, and the usage of a lot of libraries could push a jar file or WAR file pretty high, megabyte size. Currently, you can only create scaling triggers based on one metric, so you can't select multiple metrics to trigger an increase or decrease in your instances. And I think that could possibly that really could be a necessary thing. There's more than one reason why you might want to scale up or down. Would like an easy way to create a new RDS database from Eclipse. This is being very picky. I just like the fact that you can create an RDS instance from Elastic Beanstalk from the Beanstalk Management Console, and I would like some of this. I would like to have that same capability built right into Eclipse. Need to create new environments in order to get last patches on EC2 instances. So AMIs get patched by Amazon or whoever owns them. And when they get patched, those patches will not apply to instances that are running in your Beanstalk environment. They won't apply, so they won't get applied over any time. You have to actually recreate your environment for those patches to be applied to the AMIs. So that when it recreates the environment, it'll create it with those patched AMIs. Could not change environment configuration of the AWS Elastic Beanstalk environment through Eclipse. Got an error. So I got errors. And that indicated that I need to be running in a virtual private cloud, or that there was an issue related to the way it was trying to save the configuration, and it gave me a false error. I can't tell, but I couldn't change some of the configurations through the Eclipse UI, and I think that would be a great. I mean, it's either a bug or a limitation, or some kind of environmental setting, like having to deploy your application into a virtual private cloud or something to that effect. And it's too bad, because it's a great feature, and I hope they get the bugs worked out or document the error. Had issues trying to set up a working VPC, and when I eventually did get it working, I got an error in load balanced environment that custom availability zones were not permitted. I did get a VPC running, a virtual private cloud working. I was able to deploy an application to it, and I tried to load balanced application. And when I tried to make some changes, I got a different error once it was deployed into the VPC. I got that custom availability zones were not permitted in the VPC. This is a bug. I think that should have worked. So that's really the only cons that I see. There's, again, more benefits in my mind than cons. The cons, although there's numerous ones, then they're outnumbered, I think, by the benefits, and depending on what kind of application you're trying to deploy. There's a lot of resources. There's a lot of good information out there. This is just a few of them in my detailed report. I have a lot more.